era where young startups are basically forced to take their companies to even get late stage, substantial funding or to gain acquisition. And so what that basically means is just more pressure on the entrepreneur or the startup company, because they're just going to have to find clever ways to take it further. And that just means more risk. And so there are challenges in the med tech space for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I appreciate that background there. And one thing I think we've seen, and Kathy, I'm going to come to you with this next question. Obviously, reimbursement has become more and more important, right? And understanding that pathway so that the minute you have market approval, that reimbursement plan is there, you're ready for it, you know what you need. The other thing I've been seeing is, especially with large strategic companies, so any of the large players in the industry, their regulatory staff is going down and their reimbursement staff is going up. So I think, you can look at that however you want, but to me, that kind of says reimbursement's becoming really important and they're seeing that. So can you touch a little bit, maybe lay the groundwork for reimbursement, and the importance?
So you're absolutely right. And as we talked about, I came over to this small company, Inspire, from one of those large strategics, Boston Scientific. I worked at Medtronic and actually Abbott as well. And you're correct. I think that if you think about 10 years ago, when we had products in development at the large companies, we really focused on getting to the market, which equaled getting FDA approval and essentially figuring out the reimbursement piece later. And that really meant a clinical trial strategy that included a series of different clinical trials to achieve those objectives. That's a really expensive way to do business. And it also delays your time to market, your true time to market, by 6 to 8 years, because figuring out how you're going to do a randomized controlled trial to, appease Cigna or United Healthcare after you've already done a safety and efficacy trial just takes that many more years. So it's becoming increasingly apparent that we really have to get that trial strategy designed from the get-go around the reimbursement. And I think that's why we're starting to see more reimbursement talent coming into the companies to really help with that.
Mm-hmm. And so let me circle back real quick, because I have a question I want to ask Mary Kay, but let me circle back to Tim, especially because you were a startup company, you have iCore Vascular, you also work with a bunch of startup companies through NagelWriter. Maybe talk about that shift in when you're pitching to investors, the shift to really asking about your reimbursement plan, because I think we've talked about it before and you've seen that quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, I listen, the venture capital community is smart. They know what they're looking for. And so as it relates to, we can touch on regulatory and reimbursement. This is certainly an area that any venture capital firm is looking at. They want to see clear paths to commercialization, right? So they want to see that regulatory pathway is well vetted, it's understood, there's a lot of head nodding and agreement that the pathways are clean. But in parallel, they're definitely looking for, show me your health economics story. Show me, what sorts of clinical data do you have? Even if it's early clinical data, that is certainly a box that just about any venture capital group you talk to is seeking to have. And so it has to be built, when you're in an early stage development, you don't have a lot of clinical data. You don't have a lot of information because you're so focused on your get to market strategy. But I think it's important, and Kathy kind of touched on it, which is, you need to have at least that plan established. This is the type of clinical data we're going to be looking at. These are the endpoints we're going to be looking at. This is the clinical data that's going to drive adoption, et cetera, et cetera. And I mention it because it's rarely something we see when we look at startups. We rarely see this kind of thought process built into the life cycle of their development. And so it's just something I know that we try to push companies towards, because those are the big value drivers. I think those are clearly the big value drivers at the big companies. When you look at Boston and Medtronic, right? Clinical data is what moves the needle even at a level of Wall Street, as does top line revenue and earnings. But the same is true even in the startup world, right? We're learning that, getting it to market, getting some early some early physician or end user adoption is great, but really clinical data is your big value driver, where we're seeing young companies get the big exits.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, all right, this sets up perfect. I want to go down to Mary Kay, and I say down because everyone's tiled on my screen, and Mary Kay's in the second level. So
Brady Bunch.
Mary Kay, yeah. So Mary Kay, this is going to be a loaded question, so tackle it how you want. But there's the old adage that regulatory first in clinical, and I think that is sometimes people's approach, right? We're talking about it now. It's a checklist approach. So, a lot of times I'll hear common phrases like, "Well, I'm a 510K. I don't need clinical data." Well, maybe not for submission, right? But you certainly need clinical data if you want to be successful. So let's talk about, how do you think about these things when a company comes to you and is asking for a clinical strategy? How do you think about that regulatory reimbursement, the market? Kind of maybe talk through a little bit of that and how you formulate that strategy for them.
Sure. So you're right, Dwayne. People typically come to us, and I work with mostly startups, from virtual companies that have one or two people. Even before COVID, we're virtual people, and we did everything via teleconference, to the large strategics. But again, the bulk of my clients are the smaller companies, the startup companies. And their goal is to get regulatory approval as quickly as possible with the least number of patients, because that saves money and it saves time. And what I do is I really counsel them to think about what their long-term strategy is. Are they really looking to just get regulatory approval and sell the company or sell the product, which is a fine strategy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just wanting to be acquired as quickly as possible. Or are they looking as a company to develop their own market and stay on market? And when they're looking at the regulatory strategy, that's often the easiest path. So if you're looking at a strategy for regulatory, reimbursement, and marketing, they really need to look at all three of those areas at the same time at the very beginning of developing their clinical program. Because if you don't have those all in mind up front, you're not going to be able to design the most effective studies. So I can get a lot of products approved with data on 50 to 100 patients, but that's not going to get us reimbursement. It's certainly not going to drive a marketing story and gain market adoption, and it's not going to be enough to get hospital administrators to agree to put that product on their shelves. So in a very diplomatic way, I let our clients know that their regulatory goals are important, and they are, but they're not enough. They have to think about what clinical data do they need to be collecting during their clinical study or studies to drive their reimbursement story and to support whatever marketing claims that they want to have down the road. And if they're not looking to take that product to market and again, if they're looking to be acquired, they can develop a clinical study and run a clinical study that's thinking about reimbursement, thinking about marketing, collecting all of that information. That just makes them more valuable. And it adds a great deal of value to their company and their product and their whole data set if they can show that they've really been forward thinking along all three of those areas.
Yeah, Mary Kay. So that's interesting because you kind of brought this up about the regulatory path, reimbursement path. Something I think that's often overlooked, and I'm not saying this is in every scenario, but this is something that I see, and either one of you three, feel free to comment on it if I'm way off base here. But I was listening to a presentation a few weeks ago about regulatory strategy, and it was very much based on how do you get to market as quickly as possible. And the question I had for the presenter was, is that always your best path? Right. So you know, I don't, Kathy, you're shaking your head, so I'll let you comment on it first. But, you know, it was just more of a thought provoking question of, are you sure that that's your best way to market, or will you just get to market and kind of be, you know, stuck because it wasn't your best way to market? So go ahead, feel free to comment, Kathy.
Okay. Well, I'm shaking my head for two reasons. Number one, we have to remember getting procedure codes through the AMA, the clinical evidence bar is so much higher just to get your CPT codes for an outpatient procedure than it is typically to get through the FDA. But what I'm really thinking about is, well, so that time frame is a good 6 to 8 years before you start that journey and get to a place where you actually have reimbursement coverage from United Health. When during that 8-year time frame, if you have any competition on the market whatsoever, while you're working on unlisted procedure codes, really low payments to the hospitals and physicians, you're basically in a scenario where you're going to be sniped at from a pricing standpoint, because you can't go to the hospital. I'm going to talk about an implantable device, for example. A neural stimulator can cost $25,000, $30,000. How do you go to the hospital and say, would you please buy my deep brain stimulator for 30 grand when the reimbursement is sitting down around 12? Okay. And if you have any competition in that market, that's where the price erosion starts, because they can come in at a place where basically they can knock you off the block. So to me, it can actually be an incredibly dangerous strategy to launch too early when you don't have that infrastructure beneath you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Dwayne, you know, I know when we look at technologies, right, we're always looking at new things to bring into the incubator, the next big thing. And we're studying reimbursement even before we build prototypes. We're trying to make sure we understand relative to, so when you think about engineering and manufacturing, you're trying to compare your cost of goods sold. And we're comparing that to ASPs, which is tied to reimbursement. And so you're sitting here early. We're trying to understand, do we even have a way to make money here as we're building devices? Because kind of to Kathy's point, right? How many times have we seen devices kind of push their way? They jam their way through a 510K, or they jam their way through to the market, and you've just got a big gap there. And if your gross margins aren't where they need to be, or you don't have a COGS reduction strategy that's going to get you where you need to be, you're really in a tough spot with potential acquirers, or even with potential future venture capital investment opportunities. So again, it has to be thought about early. And if you haven't, you know, you could be, you know, spending a lot of money that's kind of a bridge to nowhere.
One of the things that I've encountered a lot with clients is, you know, rightfully so, they are super excited about their technology, whether it's a class 2 device or it's the, you know, a true game-changing class 3 device. And they all want to sell it for a tremendous amount of money, and that's a great goal. But when I'm thinking, or I'm talking to them about using the 510K pathway for a regulatory approval, that tends to be the simplest and fastest pathway. But in order to use a 510K pathway, you have to identify a predicate product where you say, I'm substantially equivalent to that product. And if you want to sell your product for $5,000, but the predicate is only getting reimbursed for $100, that's all you're going to get. So from a clinical strategy standpoint, again, pulling in your marketing strategy, pulling in your reimbursement strategy, you have to be really careful when you're developing a 510K strategy to know what the reimbursement is for that predicate product, because that realistically is probably what you're also going to get. And Kathy, I don't know if you want to maybe add to that. This is your area of expertise.
No, that is such a brilliant comment. You're absolutely correct, because reimbursement is based on buckets of payments, right? And there is no way you're going to go to a physician or to a hospital to sell something at a substantially different price point than what they're going to get reimbursed. It just, in my experience, it just doesn't work. So Yeah, it's right.
Yeah.
I was kind of laughing because when I worked at one of the large companies, the reimbursement team would, some of the leaders would get together once in a while every quarter. And we used to joke that we would pray our new products did not go through the 510K process because we so desperately needed the incremental evidence that we knew we would get if we did a full PMA submission.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So two comments. Mary Kay, you brought up the 510K. I feel like I see this debate most often with clients is when it's, are they a 510K or are they a Denovo? And right away they want to avoid that Denovo submission. And maybe that's what's best for their business. But my usually what I try to just question them on, are you sure that's the right path, for the success of your company? Because the one thing I want to bring up, and Tim and I talked about this on an episode of my podcast, and we talked about it back at JP Morgan all the way in January, which feels like the last time I had interaction with people in the industry. Tim, we talked about something that I didn't really know about, and I want you to kind of talk about it because I think this is important here because we're talking about getting to market and getting stuck. And a lot of times you were telling me that you will see companies have these, as startup companies have these exits, right? That look like they're really successful on the surface for the entrepreneurs and the rest of the team. And then once you talk to that person, you realize it actually wasn't that great for them because they had been stuck on the market for so long and they barely owned any of their company. Can you maybe add some clarity to that? I'm sure I'm butchering that a bit, but maybe just add some depth to that.
No, I think it's, again, we're very focused, at least from my perspective, we're very focused on startup strategy and helping companies, retain their value as founders, as early investors. These are the guys who normally get clobbered in the med tech space. They get to a point where they didn't realize what their funding strategy was, or they got to market and they had some boxes that they weren't able to check. Things happen. Innovation is not easy. And so I think, what we see a lot, especially as I almost call it the secondary valley of death, is you get approval and you're kind of like, great, we're ready for commercialization. And there's this big, second valley of death that they're just sitting in and kind of stuck in and can't figure out how to move, because it's a big risk. It's a big, commercial strategy, post-market clinical data. All of this stuff is very daunting and very expensive and has long returns on investments, et cetera, et cetera. And so kind of getting to the point is, I think what you see a lot out there, Dwayne, is you see fatigue. Here you were 3-5 years in development, you're all the way to market. Maybe you've got an early limited market release and fatigue starts to set in, and you've spent a lot of money, investors are fatigued, the team is fatigued. And so a lot of times what you see is just that these companies, they might have had a $40 million exit or a $30 million exit, and you recognize that they've actually spent, nearly $25 million to get there. And so on the surface, you and I joked, we looked at a number of different exits and we were looking at different comps, and you see these numbers and you say, wow, these guys must have killed it. And then you get to know the CEOs and you get to know the founders, and you say, wow, not one of them took a dollar out of it. And so that's where, as an incubator, I can just tell you, that's something we really try to preserve. Easier said than done, of course, right? But the guys making the money often are the late stage money that comes in. And we see a lot of times that founders and early investors really get squashed in the medical device process. So again, it does come back to regulatory and reimbursement and clinical. It comes back to really having a really sound understanding of your strategy, being able to stick to that strategy, building a fundraising strategy around that strategy, so that you don't get fatigued or you don't get into a bind. And there's so many lessons learned out there over the last 10 years that, I don't feel like med tech has embraced completely. I think there's just a better way. And, we just, what we used to do for 20, 25 million, we've got to find ways to do it for under 10. I think that's where it really boils down to. And you just have to be smarter. That's it.
Yeah. So, Mary Kay, do you think about this? Because I don't want the listeners to think this is, like it's static, right? Once you have this plan, that's going to be your plan the entire time you're there, right? So do you think of it as, okay, the regulatory strategy has changed, and that means maybe, or maybe reimbursement has changed in the last 3 years since you started the product, so, okay, we need to adjust for that in your clinical data. How do you keep track of that? Because that seems like it might be rather difficult. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of changes.
Well, obviously, we work as a team. So I'll drive the clinical strategy and bring in the regulatory people and bring in the reimbursement people. And then as a team, we're constantly talking about where are we at? Are we still on the right path? Are we meeting our enrollment goals in order to get us to the different milestones within the clinical process? And by using other people that have expertise in the area of regulatory and expertise in the area of reimbursement, they're better at keeping up with the changing trends, the changing thinking, let's say by FDA on certain things. They're hearing things from their colleagues about what's going on with FDA. It's critical right now obviously with COVID, FDA, the timeframes for getting pre-sub meetings with FDA, getting any kind of feedback from FDA, even the PMA and the 510K Denovo review timeframes are different. And what we used to assume was going to be a 30-day or a 60-day process is now taking longer because FDA resources have been reallocated toward focusing on the pandemic. And so by staying in constant contact with experts in these other areas as a team, it helps us keep our focus and it helps us be alert to these trends so that we can be proactive at seeing where barriers to the successful completion of the study are going to happen, and do we need to change our strategy along the way. We don't want to have to change the design of the study, but we want to be open to that if we need to in order to meet this changing reimbursement landscape or the changing regulatory landscape. And it's not often, but sometimes a new technology will be approved by FDA during the course of a clinical study for a similar technology, and that can really change what your clinical strategy is. And so when you're working with FDA up front on designing your study and in the pre-sub process and in the IDE approval process, you really want to be paying attention to the hints that FDA is giving you in their feedback. FDA is not going to tell you, you've got a competitor who's also trying to get the same product into clinical studies and onto the market. They can't tell you that, but what they can tell you is maybe you want to consider doing a statistical analysis like this, or maybe you want to consider modifying your endpoint to look at this in addition to what you're already thinking about. So when FDA gives you recommendations, you really want to try and read between the lines to understand what they're telling you, because they're probably trying to give you subtle guidance to help you be a success because they're seeing what your competitors are doing. But of course, they're not going to violate any confidentiality. So when you get these kinds of hints or guidance from FDA, again, you want to bring your reimbursement and your regulatory people back together with you and look at the whole strategy for getting that product to market and keeping that product on market. Many people think the goal of a clinical study is regulatory approval. And in a very simplistic way, yes, of course, that's the goal. But I always tell our clients, that's your first step. It's great to get your product approved. Of course, you have to get it approved. But if nobody's going to buy it, nobody's going to pay for it, nobody's going to use it, it doesn't matter that you got approval. And sometimes that's like a new concept, especially to people that are newer to the medical device space. Everybody thinks if they get regulatory approval and it's the greatest new widget out there that everybody's going to want it, but there's too many constraints on the physician side, any clinician's perspective and the hospital administrator's perspective to just acknowledge and adopt a new technology without a very strong supportive reimbursement and marketing strategy behind it.
Okay, so I have a handful of things written down I want to touch on. I want to come to we're going to start with the clinical data helping sales teams sell. But before that, anyone listening, if you have any questions, this is very informal. So you could either drop it in the chat function in Zoom or come off mute and feel free to, pipe up and ask questions. I will leave some time at the end. For everyone to ask questions of the experts, if you'd like. I could probably talk for 3 hours and ask these guys questions, but I'll leave some time for you guys. So let's talk about you. You were touching on the clinical data, and you were saying, if no one's going to buy this or adopt this technology, what's it matter? I think when we were on our pre-call, I think maybe Kathy, you had brought it up about, the best thing for your business development folks and your sales team is clinical data and having a strong reimbursement. So do you want to talk maybe a bit about your experience with that at your company?
Yeah. It's really interesting. And it actually, Tim, you were talking about that valley of death. I'm going to share a super quick story here. So Inspire, this little company spun out of Medtronic 10 years ago. And we have a brilliant CEO who is one of the people, I would say, in the industry gets it more than anybody I've worked with in terms of clinical strategy. So we did not, and hopefully this is a bright spot, we did not have to do multiple clinical studies. And we are a Denovo device, so we had a full PMA submission for regulatory. But my CEO's approach was, we're going to design this clinical trial 100% for reimbursement, okay? We're going to prove that it's better than the next best thing that every payer out there is going to pay for. And we'll back our way into ensuring that we have the appropriate safety and efficacy endpoints embedded in that trial. So our pathway with regulatory, with FDA was very straightforward. But the beautiful thing was, when we got that FDA approval, we were immediately in a position where not only did we go to the AMA to get our codes, and then to Medicare to get the payment rates set, but I actually was able to land insurance coverage with every insurer in the country over the past 3 years on the basis of a clinical trial that only had 126 patients. But it was an incredibly well-designed trial. It was randomized, it was prospective, and United Health, Medicare, Humana, you name it, Cigna, they all agreed, okay, you've got the evidence to show me that this is really a better way to treat these patients. And that immediately spills over into the commercialization and the sales support, because when we go to hospital systems to say, please buy my device, we have a very clear value proposition, not only therapeutically for the patient, but very importantly, also for the doctor who's implanting and the hospital who ultimately is paying the bill. So I don't know, it can be done. You just have to, I think, bite the bullet, take the pain, and figure it out up front. And then it can be successful. And to end that story, guess what? We just announced our earnings. We've only been IPO'd for 2.5 years. Our stock has gone up $51 in the last week. We had $167 yesterday. We IPO'd at 16 in May of 18.
Wow.
So that's the reward you're going to get from, the VCs are out of it now, but from Wall Street, if you do this properly, because they see that crisp type commercialization and clinical strategy dovetailing. And I hope it continues.
Tim, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to pile on more of the same. I think I know Inspire well. I've known them for a long time, and I think you're hitting it the nail on the head, right? You think about what are the value drivers, and clearly the team came up with a strategy, and every project's unique, right? So for us to sit here and say, well, it always works this way for device industry, it isn't necessarily true, right? Every product's unique. And you could argue, hey, I want to get to market. I want to check that box. I want to check, the 510K box. I want to check the CE mark box, and then I'll go after data. So, you can argue these different strategies all day, but I think at the end of the day, Inspire is a great example, right? They had this product. They deliberately went after what's going to drive value. And so clinical data around reimbursement, and that is going to dovetail into adoption, right? So if I'm a sales guy, what better data could you give me to help drive this product into a hospital, to help, so through the value analysis processes, through the physician societies, right? The societies all want data to drive adoption of not just that top 20%, but how do you drive it across the other 80%? And so, I think it just speaks to the value of clinical data, which drives then, top line revenues, drives your ASPs. There's just not enough you can say about how clinical data moves the needle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's important, Tim. I mean, that's something I had written down to ask the three of you, and you just answered it already. It was, as a startup company, how do you drive valuation up when you have no revenue, right? And it's not, regulatory approval. I think like we talked about, circling all the way back to the beginning, 10 years ago, maybe regulatory approval was the way you bumped your, that valuation up. Now it's more or less just a checkbox. It's okay, great, you have regulatory approval, whatever. You need it. I don't want to make light of it, but if you're trying to drive the valuation of your company up, it's clinical data and a strong reimbursement plan. So I'm glad you guys kind of tied that together. I want to circle back real quick. Kathy, you had brought it up real quick, and we kind of moved away from it. It was a PMA and how a lot of startups are afraid of it, and rightfully so. It's hard. It's the hardest type of device submission to market. However, there's a couple things I wanted to bring up with that and see if you guys wanted to comment on it. I sat down with Frank Jaslewski. He's from Medical Alley up in Minneapolis. I think if you're in the medical device industry, you probably know Frank. And he, when we were talking, he had actually just read an article that for startup companies, a lot of times people think, oh, well, I'm just trying to, get to market and get to an exit. And there was an article by one of the private equity journals that actually the exit plan for a startup company in a PMA process is actually quicker than a 510K. And, it kind of sounds like, I don't know if that's the case, but when you looked at the data they provided, it was true. So I don't know, do either one of you three want to maybe comment on that? And
I'll be quick. I think there's some definite accuracy to that, Dwayne. I think what you're seeing, and we used to argue this years ago with companies when they were trying to avoid the PMA, and I'd sit there and go, why? I mean, to me, I know it's a more expensive path on the surface when you map it out, but the realities are you're carving out a fresh pathway. It's hard for people to come up behind you. You're not just another Me Too. I mean, I don't know. You could go either way on this one. Again, it's unique probably to the program and to the team, but I could easily argue that a PMA pathway is a smarter, more value related pathway than a 510K. But more importantly, it's that, I think what we're seeing, and I kind of started the whole topic with, the burden of innovation is clearly at the startup level anyway, is beyond the 510K. So now you're having to show post-market data, you're having to show adoption and all of those things, and you're probably having to show some level of a rest of world strategy. And so when you map all that out, you got your 3 years, maybe 4 years to get to the 510K, and now you've got another 3 or 4 years of adoption and trying to get the return on that investment for commercial strategy. Now you're out 6 years on a 510K. One could argue, you could look at that data and say, well, PMA could probably get you to market in a span of 5 to 6 years as well, and arguably a much more favorable value proposition. So, I think it's a very healthy discussion to look at your pathway. If PMA versus 510K, I think initially we like to think that PMAs are much, much longer pathways to an exitable event or some magical event. I'm not sure that's necessarily true when you really map out these two different possibilities.
Yeah, Mary Kay, do you have anything to comment on that? I mean, you're our regulatory clinical guru here. I mean, does that all kind of sound about right?
It absolutely does. Excuse me. So a lot of clients, again, will want to do the 510K path, but inherently the 510K path says I'm the same as you. I'm no better. I'm no worse. That's really hard to make a compelling marketing argument once you go out there saying, you know, buy me because I'm just as good as the other guy and I'm no worse than the other guy. That's not a marketing tagline that anybody wants to put forth. And so when we start looking at the early clinical strategy and the whole program, we really do talk about what is the advantage of a 510K or a Denovo or a PMA. And as Tim said, a PMA strategy can be a very effective strategy because everybody coming after you is probably going to have to do the same kind of work that you did. And that may keep other less ambitious competitors out of the marketplace from following you. If you're a big company and you're just enhancing technology that's already out there, great, 510K is the way to go. But if you're trying to develop a new market, if you've got a new technology, you're a startup company and you really want to make a splash, a PMA pathway is probably going to get you a lot more bang for your buck. And as Tim pointed out, it's not necessarily that much longer. And from a clinical study perspective, it may not be that much more expensive, but the return on investment can be quite a bit greater. So it's sometimes what seems the simplest and easiest approach is not necessarily the best approach. And that's, again, why you want to sit down and really talk to your CEO and your clinical team, your marketing team, your reimbursement team. Everybody up front has to get together and be on the same page. You need to talk to all of these stakeholders and understand what everybody's goals are, and then pull them all together. And then that's when your strategy really comes together. Yep. It can't just be on regulatory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you know what? Kathy, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, you know, Mary Kay, what you're saying is it may be a little bit longer for the PMA strategy from a clinical evidence standpoint, but it gives you the ability to potentially shave off years of getting codes, getting payment rates set, and getting coverage from the payers. So, in fact, you could take that valley of death and turn it into a ditch of despair and, you know, just really shorten things up. So.
Yeah. So I want to make an attempt to tie this together here, because if I'm a startup company right now and I'm listening to the three of you talk, I'm sitting there and saying, great. And Mary Kay, I don't have a reimbursement clinical regulatory team. You know, I can only maybe afford one of those because we're cash strapped. And I'm going to clear this up because these are the issues that I see as I talk to clients, right? Is if you talk to a regulatory person, they are going to see the lens of product development under just a regulatory lens. So they're not looking at it in terms of, well, this is going to get you better reimbursement. And Mary Kay, you talked about it earlier. You have to make sure all the teams are talking. You know, they're going to say, well, if we do this claim, I can save you a Denovo and you could get a 510K. And that's how they see it, right? They want to get to market as quick as possible. That might not be the best business case. So, you know, the issue that, and this is something that goes back to Tim and I's days when we were working together, was how do you keep the capital burn rate down at a company, especially a startup company that has a limited amount of cash, and that's using strategic consultants in a way that, you know, you can turn those people off and on. And there's plenty of organizations that can do this, that can help you do this, that can bring a team, you know, that can sit on your team and be regulatory, reimbursement, clinical expertise, but they're not full-time staff, but they're on your team, you know? So obviously, Mary Kay, you work for Covance. Covance can do that. You know, Tim's at Nagelreiter down in Florida, and while they're, technically an engineering team, they can provide a lot of other services. So, I think for the people listening, I'll drop my email here in the chat. If you have questions you want to follow up with these with the three of these three, or even myself, feel free to email me. I can get you in touch with them. I know we have 15 minutes left, and if no one has questions, I'll keep firing away. But does anyone on the line have any specific questions they want to ask? Anything that seems unclear? Feel free to drop it in the chat. Come off mute. I'll give it like 5 seconds, and then I'm going to keep firing away. And actually, we only have 5 more minutes. It only goes till 9:20. Yeah. Okay. All right. So how about this? Instead of me asking more questions, we only have 5 more minutes. Let me just go down the line here. I'll give a chance for the three of you to wrap up. Kathy, anything else you want to add, say that we missed, touch on again?
No, I really think the takeaway message here is, to me, clinical strategy is every bit as important as technical strategy, your product strategy. And if you don't have that figured out right up front, it's gonna set you back a little bit. So I really embrace the ideas that we discussed today.
Great. Tim?
Yeah, I mean, maybe my takeaway for anybody in the med tech innovation space is this, DIY, do it yourself. It's really hard. There's a reason venture capitalists and angel investors like to, they bet on the jockey more than the horse. They're betting on the team. And there's a reason for that. It's because medical device innovation is really, really hard. And so I guess my biggest piece of advice, I work in an incubator. I'm not going to sit and promote our incubator over some other group or other incubator. I think at the end of the day, it's about just make sure you surround yourself with really strong regulatory, clinical, reimbursement people from the beginning. However you do that, you want to do it yourself, you want to be the general contractor, great, go for it. But that would just be my advice to anybody. I see too many people trying to develop in a bubble. Maybe they've got a medical advisor in themselves, and they're trying to figure this thing out. And it's just impossible for any one or even a couple of individuals to do on their own. You'll burn out, you'll get tired. So that would be my big takeaway, is just surround yourself with really strong people who know those spaces inside and out, can give you good guidance, and work hard at the start to get it right.
Mary Kay?
Yep, and then just to kind of bring it home, echoing on what Tim said, surround yourself with, a strong team, and listen to what other people on your team are saying. Talk to all the different stakeholders. Make sure you are all on the same page. A lot of times, what the CEO's vision is going to be different than the clinical vision, different than the regulatory vision, maybe different than the board of directors vision. And make sure everybody is on that same page and that everyone agrees to what the final goals are, and listen to each other and be open to thinking about other things. Again, many people come to us thinking all they want or all they need is regulatory approval. And it's really eye-opening for them to understand that, again, as we've talked a lot about today, that's your first step, and that's often your easiest step. And you have to be thinking about the bigger picture, the long-term picture, whether your goal is to take it to market and become the next big company out there, or your goal is to exit quickly and recoup your investment and move on to the next greatest thing. It doesn't matter. You have to have a strategy in place to get you to where your goals are. But until you know what your goals are as a team, as a company, you're going to be short-sighted. And again, regulatory approval, critical, but it's not the end game. For most companies, for most technologies, it's really the starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's great. And to just wrap it up, we have a minute left. Anyone listening, feel free to connect with any of us on LinkedIn. Like I said, my email is in the chat. Feel free to reach out. And I think one thing that I've learned in this industry, and it's don't hesitate to reach out to people, even if there's not a specific need from Kathy. Maybe she knows someone who can fill that need for you. The industry is that is the one thing about medtech is it is very connected. People are very open to helping, lending their time for free a lot of times, making connections. I think, I've always known that, but something that I had noticed is when I launched my podcast, I'd reach out to people to do an episode, and the people who had no business responding would come on and talk about it because they wanted to give their time back to the industry. So feel free to reach out, everyone. Outside of that, I think that's all we have. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Great. Thanks everyone again for joining us. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Bye.